In 2024, for the first time in recorded economic history, the International Monetary Fund published a forecast that restructured every strategic calculation in every foreign ministry on this planet. India, not the United States, not China, not the European Union, India, was designated the single largest contributor to global GDP growth for the next 3 consecutive fiscal years. That number was not built on hope. It was built on $3.7 trillion in current GDP, a manufacturing base expanding at 8.2% annually, and a digital infrastructure that now processes more real-time financial transactions than the entire continent of Europe combined. And when that number dropped, 10 nations picked up the phone. They called New Delhi. They asked for trade lifelines, currency swap agreements, defense partnerships, food security corridors, and diplomatic cover. And India, for the first time in its post-colonial history, said no, or more precisely, India said, not on your terms, on ours. Welcome to the Strategic Intelligence Report. For the next 15 minutes, we are going to dissect the most consequential geopolitical realignment of the 21st century. Before we name the nations, we need to understand why India's leverage exists, because this is not a story about arrogance. This is a story about structural inevitability. For 70 years after independence, India operated under what analysts called the Nehruvian constraint, a foreign policy built on non-alignment, caution, and economic protectionism. Western capitals treated New Delhi as a recipient of aid, not an architect of order. Then, between 2014 and 2024, something shifted at the structural level. The Unified Payments Interface became the world's most advanced real-time payment system, processing 13.89 billion transactions in a single month. The production-linked incentive scheme pulled $26 billion in committed investment from Apple, Samsung, and over 700 global corporations. India launched 116 satellites in a single mission, and the India Stack became the most studied government technology framework by developing nations from Southeast Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa. This isn't just a trend, this is a permanent shift in the global order. Under Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy architecture, India formally adopted what is now called strategic autonomy, the principle that India will engage multilaterally, but will never subordinate its national interest to any single power bloc. India today sits inside the Quad with the United States, and inside BRICS with Russia and China. It buys Russian oil at discounted rates, and sells refined petroleum products to European markets at a premium. This is not hypocrisy. This is macroeconomic sovereignty. The ability to write your own terms in every room you enter. If you value data-driven geopolitical intelligence over surface-level narratives, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. What we are covering today is the analysis that foreign policy desks in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing are running right now. You deserve to see it too. Let us now run the strategic ledger. 10 nations, 10 requests, 10 refusals. Nation 1, Sri Lanka. In April 2022, Sri Lanka experienced the most catastrophic sovereign debt implosion in South Asian history. Foreign reserves fell to under $50 million, insufficient to cover 2 weeks of essential imports. Colombo requested $4 billion from India with no conditions attached. India extended $3.8 billion in support, but conditioned every dollar on Sri Lanka pursuing IMF structural reform. India told Colombo, "We will help you survive, but you will implement fiscal discipline, and you will not pivot to Beijing to escape accountability." Sri Lanka had no alternative. It accepted. India emerged from the crisis as Colombo's primary strategic partner, displacing Chinese influence in the process. India does not offer blank checks. It offers structured leverage. Nation 2, Pakistan. In back-channel exchanges between 2022 and 2023, Pakistani economic officials floated the possibility of resuming bilateral trade with India. Pakistan's economy was in institutional paralysis, inflation above 38%, foreign reserves critically low. Indian agricultural commodities, pharmaceuticals, and textiles were available at prices no alternative supplier could match. The economic logic was overwhelming. India's response was a sovereign, "Not yet." New Delhi's position was clear. Bilateral trade normalization requires verifiable action on cross-border terrorism infrastructure. No political architecture, no trade corridor. Every month without Indian trade access cost Pakistan approximately $1.2 billion in alternative supply chain costs. But India held the line because strategic credibility, the credibility of your red lines, is worth more than any single trade agreement. That is the behavior of a superpower, not a regional player. Nation 3, the Maldives. In late 2023, the newly elected Maldivian president formally requested India withdraw its military personnel from the archipelago. The political optics were framed as a sovereignty assertion. The strategic subtext was a tilt toward Beijing. India complied with the withdrawal request, but simultaneously suspended preferential trade frameworks and activated the structural reality that the Maldives receives over 70% of its essential imports through Indian logistics networks. Within 4 months, Malé was back at the table, not asking for the troops to return, but requesting the resumption of economic cooperation that India had quietly paused. India did not make a single aggressive statement during this entire episode. It simply allowed economic gravity to operate, because when you are a $3.7 trillion economy adjacent to a $7 billion economy, you don't need to raise your voice. Your structural weight speaks for you. Nation 4, Canada. In September 2023, Prime Minister Trudeau publicly alleged Indian government involvement in the killing of a Khalistani separatist on Canadian soil. Ottawa reduced India's diplomatic presence, sought Five Eyes intelligence alignment against New Delhi, and attempted to build a multilateral pressure framework. Canada's expectation was that India would respond with defensive diplomacy and an eagerness to restore normalcy. India's response was categorically different. New Delhi expelled 41 Canadian diplomats. India suspended visa services for Canadian nationals, and Prime Minister Modi refused bilateral engagement with Trudeau for an extended period. To understand why this is a turning point, we have to look at the data they missed. India is Canada's 9th largest trading partner. Canada is India's 22nd largest trading partner. The leverage differential is not subtle. Furthermore, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia all refused to meaningfully downgrade their India relationships in solidarity with Ottawa. Canada discovered what post-colonial powers are still learning. India is no longer a country you can afford to make an enemy of. Nation 5, Germany. Germany experienced its worst economic contraction in over a decade in 2023, shrinking 0.3% of GDP while managing an energy crisis and deindustrialization pressure. Berlin sought a fast-tracked free trade agreement with India, seeking preferential access to Indian manufacturing and its consumer market. India's response was a masterclass in multilateral choreography. New Delhi made clear that any FTA acceleration required the EU to address Indian concerns, data localization sovereignty, pharmaceutical intellectual property frameworks, agricultural protections, and critically, recognition of Indian professional certifications to allow Indian skilled workers access to European labor markets. Germany wanted Indian manufacturing without Indian professionals. India said, you get both, or you wait. As of this analysis, Germany is still waiting, and the structural pressure on Berlin intensifies with every quarter of European underperformance. Nation 6, the United States. This is the most complex entry in our ledger. Washington applied sustained strategic pressure across multiple domains, pressuring India to reduce Russian oil purchases after the Ukraine invasion, pressuring India to adopt Western-aligned UN positions on Russia, pressuring India to accelerate military alignment with NATO standard systems. India's response to every pressure point was identical. We will make decisions in India's strategic interest. India continued purchasing Russian crude at $12 to $14 below Brent benchmark, refining it and selling petroleum products globally. India abstained on critical UN resolutions regarding Ukraine. India negotiated the GE F414 jet engine co-production deal, acquiring American technology transfer, while simultaneously maintaining the Russian S-400 missile defense system, despite threats of CAATSA sanctions from Washington. And then, the most significant unreported moment of this entire era, the United States chose not to impose those sanctions. The United States, which sanctioned Turkey, a NATO ally, for purchasing the same S-400 system, chose not to sanction India. That quiet decision in the U.S. National Security Council is the moment America's strategic establishment formally acknowledged, India is not a country you pressure. India is a country you negotiate with. We are 6 nations in, and I want you to notice one pattern. Every nation arrived at New Delhi with a request framed as urgent, bilateral, and mutually beneficial, and India responded by expanding the frame, introducing conditions, linkages, and sovereign requirements that transform the transaction into a relationship restructuring. This is the grammar of global leadership. Let us finish the ledger. Nations 7 and 8. Nepal and Bangladesh. Nepal approached India seeking a fast-tracked deal to sell 10,000 megawatts of hydropower to India and Bangladesh. India introduced one structural condition Kathmandu had not anticipated. Chinese firms would not be awarded construction contracts for transmission infrastructure connecting to the Indian grid. Infrastructure is not neutral in a geopolitical context. India was drawing a sovereign red line around its energy grid security. Nepal is still negotiating. The leverage remains with New Delhi. Bangladesh's $47 billion garment industry runs on Indian yarn, dyes, machinery, and logistics. When Dhaka sought to renegotiate trade frameworks to disadvantage Indian textile competitors, India signaled that any renegotiation would require a comprehensive bilateral review, including transit rights, water sharing agreements, and border infrastructure. You cannot renegotiate one chapter of a multi-chapter relationship in isolation. Bangladesh withdrew the request. India has mastered what strategists call issue linkage, connecting multiple policy domains into a single integrated leverage framework. India no longer accepts disaggregated diplomacy. Nations 9 and 10, Myanmar and Kenya. Myanmar's military junta, isolated by Western capitals after the 2021 coup, sought Indian trade normalization and diplomatic legitimacy at multilateral forums. India maintained calibrated engagement, protecting border infrastructure, maintaining humanitarian corridors, but refused to become the junta's international legitimacy provider, not ideological purity, not transactional opportunism. Calibrated sovereign interest. Kenya and the East African community sought Indian assistance building digital payment and identity infrastructure. They expected the traditional development aid framework, grants, technical teams, capacity building programs. India declined that framework entirely. Instead, New Delhi offered direct deployment of the India Stack architecture, but under bilateral digital sovereignty agreements that would make India the primary technical and standards partner for East African digital infrastructure. India was not selling technology. India was exporting the architecture of its own digital ecosystem, creating structural alignment that would shape East African digital standards for decades. This is how technological superpowers establish lasting influence, not through military bases, not through debt traps, through the invisible architecture that runs every phone, every transaction, every government service. Kenya is still negotiating, on India's terms. Now let us address the structural question every serious analyst is asking. Why does India hold this leverage? The answer sits across 5 pillars. Pillar 1. Demographic dominance. India is the world's most populous nation at 1.44 billion people, with a median age of 28 years. Germany's median age is 44. Japan's is 49. India is not just a large market. India is a young market, still in its early expansion phase. For any global corporation planning beyond a 10-year horizon, India is not optional. It is mandatory. Pillar 2. Digital infrastructure superiority. 13.89 billion UPI transactions in a single month. A payment system achieving 99.9% uptime serving 1.4 billion users. Nations that want to interoperate with this infrastructure must do so on Indian technical terms. Pillar 3. Pharmaceutical sovereignty. India manufactures 20% of global generic pharmaceutical exports by volume, 60% of global vaccine production capacity by dose, 57% of all antiretroviral drugs used globally in HIV treatment. During COVID-19, when India temporarily restricted exports, vaccination programs in 92 countries were directly impacted. That is not market share. That is strategic dependency. Pillar 4. Global South leadership. During India's G20 presidency in 2023, New Delhi secured a consensus declaration from all 20 member nations, including Russia, China, the US, and the EU, centered on Global South development priorities. The African Union was admitted as a permanent G20 member under Indian presidency. India permanently expanded the table of global governance in a direction that amplifies its own voice. Pillar 5. The energy transition, chokehold. India is the world's third largest solar energy producer. It committed to 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030, the largest green infrastructure build-out in the history of any developing nation. And India is simultaneously manufacturing solar components, green hydrogen systems, and battery storage technology at cost structures Western manufacturers cannot match. The green transition is not happening without India. Any nation that wants to meet its Paris Agreement commitments needs Indian manufacturing capacity. That is macroeconomic dominance, not projected. Delivered. By 2027, India will be the world's third largest economy by nominal GDP, surpassing Japan and Germany. By 2030, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, if fully operationalized, will carry more annual trade value than the current Suez Canal route. By 2035, India's digital economy is projected to reach $1 trillion in annual value, a parallel digital economic architecture centered on Indian standards and Indian platforms. The 10 nations in today's analysis will not be the last to arrive at New Delhi's table. India will evaluate each request through one sovereign lens. Does this serve India's structural interests? Does this advance India's long-term architecture? Does this respect India's strategic autonomy? If yes, partnership. If no, the door remains cordially, firmly, and permanently closed. This is not arrogance. This is the grammar of great power conduct, and India has finally, irreversibly, learned to speak it fluently. I leave you with the only question that actually matters. How are you positioning yourself for a global economy that India now helps to architect? Are you watching the old power centers, waiting for recoveries that the data says are not coming fast enough? Or are you recalibrating, studying the new trade corridors, the new technology standards, the new diplomatic grammar of a multipolar world where New Delhi is a mandatory stop on every strategic itinerary? The roadmap for India's financial dominance, the specific sectors, corridors, and investment architectures that will define the next decade, is the subject of our next deep dive. Subscribe, set the notification, and come back prepared. Because in this new global order, the informed move first. This has been the Strategic Intelligence Report.